Here is a mystery that began before anyone realized there was a mystery at all. In June of 1941, the greatest military machine the world had ever seen crossed into Soviet territory with absolute confidence. German commanders radioed back reports of easy victories, obsolete enemy tanks falling like wheat before a scythe. The intelligence reports were clear, the assessments unanimous. The Soviet armored force was a relic of the past, inferior in every conceivable measure. And yet, within months, something would happen that would send shockwaves through the highest echelons of the Wehrmacht, forcing Germany's most brilliant engineers to gather around a captured machine and admit reluctantly that everything they believed about their own tanks was wrong. The question that haunted them was deceptively simple. How could a nation they considered technologically backward produce a tank that rendered their entire armored doctrine obsolete? The answer, like all great mysteries, was hidden in plain sight from the very beginning, embedded in steel, in angles, in the physics of war itself. But to understand the revelation, we must first understand the deception. We must trace the clues from the first encounter to the final devastating conclusion. And if you find this investigation compelling, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because the mystery runs deeper than anyone imagined. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, began on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military operation in human history, involving more than 3 million soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and nearly 3,000 aircraft. German commanders expected a swift victory, perhaps 6 weeks, perhaps 10. Their confidence was not unfounded. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in a month, France in 6 weeks, and Greece in 3. Soviet forces, by contrast, had performed poorly against tiny Finland in the Winter War, revealing what appeared to be a military plagued by incompetence and purged of its best officers by Stalin's paranoia. The first clue appeared on the second day of the invasion, June 23, 1941. German reconnaissance units reported encountering an unknown type of Soviet tank near the frontier. The reports were confused, contradictory. Some described a vehicle that shrugged off anti-tank rounds as if they were pebbles thrown by children. Others spoke of machines that simply drove through defensive positions, crushing anti-tank guns beneath their treads when their ammunition ran dry. The Wehrmacht leadership dismissed these reports initially. Fog of war, they said. Panic among inexperienced troops. The Soviet Union possessed no tank that could threaten German armored supremacy. But the reports kept coming. At the Battle of Raseiniai in Lithuania, a single massive Soviet tank, later identified as a KV heavy tank, blocked the advance of elements of the German 6th Panzer Division for an entire day. German gunners fired round after round at the metal behemoth. Nothing penetrated. They brought up an 88mm anti-aircraft gun and scored direct hits. The tank finally fell silent, not because German weapons had defeated it, but because it had exhausted its ammunition. When German soldiers finally approached the vehicle, they counted over a dozen impacts on its armor. None had breached the steel. Similar encounters were being reported along the entire front. The 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank gun, the standard German anti-tank weapon, proved almost entirely useless against these new Soviet vehicles. German crews had already given this weapon a nickname during the French campaign. They called it the door knocker, because against heavily armored tanks it merely announced the crew's presence without inflicting any damage. Against the new Soviet tanks, even this grim humor seemed inadequate. Reports indicated that shells simply bounced off at ranges where German gunners would normally expect clean kills. What the Germans had encountered were two tanks they never expected to face, the T-34 medium tank and the KV heavy tank. Both had been developed in secret during the late 1930s, and German intelligence had failed to detect their existence. This intelligence failure was itself a clue, a hint that the confidence underpinning Operation Barbarossa was built on incomplete information. But in the chaos of the invasion's opening weeks, German commanders had little time for reflection. The advance was proceeding, Soviet losses were catastrophic, and surely these new tanks were exceptions, not the rule. By the beginning of July, Soviet Mechanized Corps had lost staggering numbers of vehicles. The 6th Mechanized Corps, which had begun the war with over 450 T-34s and KVs, had ceased to exist as a fighting formation by June 27th. The 4th Mechanized Corps was reduced to 45 modern tanks out of an original 414 by mid-July. These losses seem to confirm German assessments. Yes, the new Soviet tanks were formidable in isolation, but they were being destroyed in massive quantities nonetheless. The system was working. But here lies a second clue, one that would only become apparent upon closer examination. German battle reports did not account for these massive Soviet losses. If the Wehrmacht had destroyed over 1,000 T-34s and KVs in the first 2 weeks of the invasion, where were the combat reports? Where were the victory claims from panzer crews? The answer revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Soviet tanks were not being destroyed by German weapons. They were being lost to mechanical failures, to fuel shortages, to the chaos of Soviet command structures. At least half of all Soviet tank losses in the first summer were attributed to breakdowns rather than enemy fire. The original air filter on the T-34 was so poorly designed that engines would seize from dust and sand ingestion. Transmissions failed. Crews abandoned perfectly functional vehicles because they had no fuel or no orders. This was both reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because it explained German survival against superior armor. Alarming because it implied that if the Soviets ever solved their logistical and mechanical problems, the Germans would face a very different equation. But such strategic concerns were matters for later analysis. In the autumn of 1941, the immediate concern was reaching Moscow before winter. The clue that could not be ignored arrived on October 4, 1941, near the town of Metsensk, south of Orel. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group had been advancing rapidly toward Moscow when the 4th Panzer Division encountered a Soviet armored counterattack. What happened next changed everything. A group of T-34 tanks, well handled by their crews and operating on favorable terrain, inflicted severe casualties on the German division. The 4th Panzer Division suffered significant losses in vehicles and men. German shells that struck the T-34s at standard combat ranges simply failed to penetrate. Meanwhile, the Soviet 76mm guns tore through German armor with ease. Guderian was not a man given to panic. He was one of the Wehrmacht's most celebrated commanders, the father of German armored doctrine. But the encounter at Metsensk shook him deeply. He requested an immediate inquiry into the realities of tank warfare on the Eastern Front. More radically still, he suggested that Germany should simply copy the T-34 directly. If the Soviets had solved the problem of combining firepower, protection, and mobility in a single vehicle, then surely the fastest path to parity was imitation. This suggestion revealed the depth of the crisis. German military culture prided itself on innovation, on engineering excellence, on being the leaders rather than the followers in armored warfare. For Guderian to suggest copying a Soviet design was an admission that German tanks had fallen behind, perhaps fatally so. The mystery had become impossible to ignore. How had the Soviet Union, a nation the Reich considered culturally and technologically inferior, produced a weapon that surpassed German engineering? On November 20th, 1941, a special commission arrived on the Eastern Front. This was not an ordinary military delegation. The Panzer Commission included Ferdinand Porsche, the legendary designer whose name would later grace sports cars, but who at that moment was one of Germany's foremost armored vehicle engineers. It included Oskar Hacker, deputy head of the commission and director of the Steyr Company. It included Heinrich Kniepkamp, the civilian head of the Tank Commission, and Colonel Sebastian Fichtner of the Ordnance Directorate. Representatives from Germany's greatest industrial firms, Krupp, Daimler-Benz, Henschel, MAN, and Rheinmetall, accompanied them. These were the men who had designed the Panzer III and Panzer IV, the vehicles that had conquered Europe. Now they were being sent to examine a Soviet tank and determine why their creations had been found wanting. If you're finding this investigation revealing, this is an ideal moment to subscribe and ensure you don't miss the conclusion. The evidence the Commission uncovered would reshape German tank design for the remainder of the war. At the Kummersdorf Proving Ground south of Berlin and later at frontline positions, the Commission examined captured T-34s with the meticulous attention of detectives at a crime scene. They measured armor thickness. They calculated slope angles. They tested penetration at various ranges with German weapons. weapons. They disassembled the Soviet diesel engine and studied its construction. Every observation was another clue, and together they formed a picture that German engineers found deeply troubling. The first revelation concerned armor configuration. German tanks of this period used armor plates that were positioned vertically or nearly vertically. This was a straightforward design choice. Vertical armor was easier to manufacture, easier to weld, and simplified the construction of the vehicle's interior. But the T-34's designers had made a different choice. The tank's glacis plate, the frontal armor that faced enemy fire, was sloped at a dramatic angle, approximately 60 degrees from vertical. This was not merely an aesthetic difference, it was a fundamental shift in protective philosophy. When a shell strikes vertical armor, it must penetrate the full thickness of the plate. But when a shell strikes sloped armor at an angle, two things happen. First, the effective thickness the shell must traverse increases dramatically, as if the armor were much thicker than its actual measurement. Second, there is a significant chance that the shell will ricochet, deflecting off the angled surface rather than penetrating. The T-34's 45 millimeters of frontal armor sloped at 60 degrees provided protection equivalent to 90 millimeters or more of vertical armor. German engineers performed the calculations and realized that their own tanks, with their vertical plates, required far more steel to achieve the same level of protection. The Soviets had found a way to make armor more efficient. The second revelation concerned the tank's main armament. The T-34 mounted a 76.2 mm F-34 tank gun. This weapon was longer-barreled and more powerful than anything mounted on German medium tanks at the time. The Panzer III carried a 50 mm gun. The Panzer IV carried a short-barreled 75 mm weapon, but this was designed primarily for infantry support, firing high-explosive rounds rather than anti-tank projectiles. At typical combat ranges, the T-34's gun could penetrate any German tank frontally, while German tanks struggled to penetrate the T-34 at any range from the front. Engineers from the Weapons Testing Office conducted firing trials. They positioned captured T-34s at various distances and engaged them with German anti-tank guns. The 37 mm PaK-36, the weapon that had served Germany through Poland, France, and Greece, could not penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at any combat range whatsoever. The 50 mm PaK-38, a newer weapon just entering service, fared little better, requiring dangerously close ranges to achieve penetration. Only the 88 mm flak gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, could reliably defeat the T-34's armor at safe distances. But the 88 was large, heavy, difficult to move, and never intended for anti-tank work. German infantry on the Eastern Front, armed with standard anti-tank weapons, were essentially defenseless against T-34s unless they could score lucky hits on tracks or vision ports. The third revelation concerned mobility. The T-34 rode on wide tracks that distributed its weight across a larger surface area. This gave it far better performance on soft ground, mud, and snow than German tanks, which used narrower tracks and tended to sink in conditions where the T-34 could still maneuver. The Christie suspension system, licensed from an American inventor and perfected by Soviet engineers, provided excellent cross-country speed and the ability to absorb rough terrain. During the Russian winter of 1941-42, this advantage became critical. German tanks bogged down in mud that seemed to swallow them, while T-34s continued to operate. The Panzer IV's inferior leaf spring suspension and narrow tracks made it far less capable in the conditions that actually prevailed on the Eastern Front. The fourth revelation concerned the diesel engine. The T-34 was powered by the V2 diesel engine, a 12-cylinder power plant that produced 500 horsepower. German tanks used gasoline engines. Diesel fuel is less flammable than gasoline, which meant that T-34s were less likely to catch fire when penetrated. Diesel engines also offered better fuel efficiency, extending the tank's operational range. German engineers studied the V2 engine with intense interest. Could they copy it? Could they develop their own diesel tank engine? The answer, frustratingly, was that Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce aluminum diesel engines in sufficient quantities. The V2 required aluminum alloy in its construction, and German aluminum supplies were already stretched thin by aircraft production. This was a logistical clue, a hint that the war was not only about engineering brilliance, but about industrial capacity and resource allocation. But here the mystery deepens, for if the T-34 was so superior, why had the Germans been winning? Why had Soviet tank losses been so catastrophic? The Commission's investigation revealed the other side of the equation, the flaws that had saved Germany in 1941. The T-34's two-man turret was a significant weakness. The tank commander had to serve simultaneously as the gunner, locating targets, aiming the main gun, and firing, while also attempting to maintain awareness of the tactical situation around the vehicle. In German tanks, these duties were divided between a separate commander and gunner. This crew configuration allowed German tanks to acquire and engage targets much faster. Reports indicated that German tanks could typically fire 3 rounds for every 1 round fired by a T-34. In the chaos of tank combat, this rate of fire advantage often proved decisive. The T-34's optical systems and vision devices were inferior to German equivalents. Soviet tank commanders had difficulty identifying targets and maintaining situational awareness. A T-34 platoon would often focus on a single target selected by the platoon leader rather than engaging multiple threats simultaneously, squandering the firepower advantage of having 3 independently operating tanks. German crews exploited this limitation ruthlessly, maneuvering to flanks and rear where Soviet armor was thinner. Soviet crew training in 1941 was abysmal compared to German standards. Many tank crews had only minimal instruction before being sent into combat. Mechanical problems that an experienced crew might have diagnosed and repaired became mission-ending failures for inexperienced soldiers. The purges of the late 1930s had eliminated many of the Red Army's most capable officers, and the Tank Corps particularly had suffered from this loss of experienced leadership. And finally, there were the mechanical reliability problems that had plagued the T-34 from its introduction. The Pullman air filter was nearly useless at preventing dust ingestion. Transmissions were prone to failure. Clutch assemblies broke under stress. Half of all T-34 losses in the first summer of the war came from mechanical breakdowns rather than enemy action. German engineers noted these flaws, but they also recognized that such problems were solvable. A better air filter could be designed, transmissions could be improved, crew training could be enhanced. The fundamental design of the T-34 was sound, perhaps brilliant. Its implementation was flawed, but those flaws were temporary. The Commission filed its report. The conclusions were stark. Germany's current medium tanks, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, were not capable of meeting the T-34 on equal terms. Upgrading these vehicles with longer-barreled guns and additional armor could provide a temporary solution, but a new tank was required, one that incorporated the lessons learned from examining the T-34. The suggestion to copy the Soviet design directly was rejected. Germany could not produce the required aluminum and diesel engines, and there were concerns about incorporating unfamiliar Soviet design philosophies. Instead, a new tank would be developed that incorporated the T-34's best features into a German framework. This new tank would become the Panther. Daimler-Benz and Mahan were asked to develop a 30-ton vehicle incorporating 3 key features directly inspired by the T-34: a long, overhanging gun for superior anti-tank capability, wide tracks for good off-road mobility, and sloped glacis armor for improved protection with modest steel thickness. Hitler preferred the Daimler-Benz design, which more closely resembled the T-34 in overall configuration. But the weapons department chose the MAN design, which retained more traditional German engineering practices. By the time the Panther entered production in 1943, it had grown to nearly 45 tons, far exceeding the original specifications. The Tiger heavy tank, already under development before the T-34 encounter, was accelerated into production. Armed with the feared 88mm gun and protected by thick armor, the Tiger could defeat the T-34. But the Tiger was expensive, complex, and produced in limited numbers. It could not replace the thousands of medium tanks the Wehrmacht required. The investigation at Kummersdorf and on the Eastern Front had revealed a truth that German leadership found difficult to accept. The Soviet Union, despite its apparent backwardness, had produced a weapon that represented a generational leap in tank design. German tanks, which had conquered Europe, were indeed obsolete when measured against this new standard. The sloped armor, the powerful gun, the wide tracks, the diesel engine, these were not incremental improvements. They represented a fundamental rethinking of what a tank should be. But perhaps the most important clue, the one that tied all the others together, was this. The T-34 had been designed for the conditions of the Soviet Union, for vast distances, poor roads, extreme temperatures, and industrial limitations that required efficient use of steel. German tanks had been designed for the conditions of Western Europe, for good roads, moderate distances, and well-supplied armies. When German tanks entered Soviet territory, they entered an environment for which they were fundamentally unsuited, while facing an opponent that had designed specifically for that environment. The mystery, in the end, was not how the Soviets had built a better tank. It was how the Germans had failed to anticipate that they would. The T-34's influence on tank design extended far beyond Germany. Allied nations studied captured examples and incorporated lessons into their own development programs. The sloped armor philosophy became standard worldwide. The emphasis on gun armor mobility balance that the T-34 exemplified influenced tank design for decades. Historians would later debate whether the T-34 was truly the best tank of World War II, some pointing to its flaws, others to its strengths, but none could deny its impact. The tank that German engineers examined at Kummersdorf in 1941 changed the course of armored warfare. What of the men who conducted the examination? Ferdinand Porsche continued designing vehicles for the Reich, including the massive Ferdinand tank destroyer and various failed projects that bore his obsessive engineering ambitions. Heinrich Kniepkamp worked on suspension systems and half-track vehicles. The engineers from Krupp and Rheinmetall turned their attention to bigger guns and heavier armor, always chasing the advantage the T-34 had demonstrated. The war they fought from that point forward was shaped by the lessons learned in November 1941, when they stood around a captured Soviet tank and admitted, perhaps only to themselves, that they had been wrong. The captured T-34 that was examined at Kummersdorf still exists, preserved in a Russian museum. The measurements taken by German engineers, the test results, the reports they wrote, all survived in archives on both sides. These documents confirm what the mystery investigation revealed. German tanks in 1941 were not designed to fight the T-34. They could defeat Soviet tanks through superior crew training, superior tactics, and by exploiting Soviet mechanical and organizational failures. But in a straight comparison of armor, firepower, and mobility, the T-34 was the superior vehicle. German engineers admitted this in their reports, even if German propaganda never acknowledged it publicly. And so the mystery reaches its conclusion. The Germans entered the Soviet Union believing their tanks were the finest in the world. They encountered a tank they had never anticipated, one that exploited physics and engineering principles they had overlooked. They investigated, they analyzed, and they admitted the truth. Their tanks were obsolete. The solution they developed, the Panther and the improved Panzer IV, came too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the war. The T-34, despite its many flaws, was produced in such quantities and improved so continuously that by war's end, over 50,000 had been built. German engineers could analyze, admire, and imitate, but they could not match Soviet production capacity. The final clue, then, is not about engineering at all. It is about industrial power, about the ability to produce weapons in sufficient numbers to absorb losses and continue fighting. Germany built approximately 6,000 Panthers during the war. The Soviet Union built over 80,000 T-34s in all variants. The mystery of German tank obsolescence was not truly solved by building better tanks. It was decided by who could build more. And in that equation, the T-34's simplicity, its ease of production, its tolerance for unskilled labor, proved as important as its sloped armor and powerful gun. If this investigation has revealed something you didn't know about the Second World War, consider subscribing and sharing this channel. The history of armored warfare is filled with such mysteries, moments when certainty gave way to doubt, when engineers had to admit that their assumptions were wrong. The German examination of the T-34 was one such moment, perhaps the most significant in the entire war. It forced a nation that believed itself technologically supreme to confront evidence that they had fallen behind, and in that confrontation lies a lesson that extends far beyond tanks and armor. Certainty is dangerous. The enemy you underestimate may have already solved problems you haven't yet imagined. The clues are always there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to examine them honestly. The German engineers at Kummersdorf, to their credit, did exactly that. They examined, they measured, they tested, and they admitted the truth. Their own tanks were obsolete. The tragedy for Germany was that this truth came too late to change anything.